I don't know that I consider myself a jazz musician, but I'm somebody who has studied jazz and knows a lot about jazz, and I play an instrument that's mostly associated with jazz.
Good evening, George. Welcome to Chat with Chithra. How are you doing today?
I'm doing quite well. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's morning for me here in Northern California. So,
Right. Okay, good. For those of you who do not know George Brooks is a renowned saxophonist, composer, and music educator at Earth Brother Music from California. George, you are the founder of many jazz fusion groups such as Summit, Aspada, and Bombay Jazz. What was it like working with John McLaughlin, who is one of the pioneers of jazz fusion music?
well, John and I met actually at Zakir Hussein's house, although I'd obviously been following John's music for a long time, as me as a lover of Indian classical music, but a Western musician playing a Western instrument, the saxophone.
Mm,
Uh, I've been attracted to and curious about different ways of blending Eastern and Western forms of music, or Indian and Western forms of music.
mm,
And, Shakti was really the sort of the guiding light for that work.
mm.
And living in Northern California, I'd been able to get to know Zakir Hussain through sitarist Krishna Bhatt, who was a close friend of mine. And Zakir was kind of instrumental in my career, putting out my first two albums on his Moment Records label.
Right.
So in the early 2000s, I started performing in India. I'd been going to India to study in the early, actually in 1980 was my first trip to India.
Mm,
But as a student, just learning about vocal music, Hindustani, Khayal, vocal music. That was
yeah.
kind of my entry into it. Zakir, since 2001, every year he has a memorial concert for his father, Ustad Ala Rakha Khan.
Mm,
And this one particular year, and I would often be in India at that time because that's the concert season. So this
mm.
one particular year, John McLaughlin was also in India, and the concerts start at 6 in the morning or 5:30 in the morning, and
Wow.
generally with a classical exposition, and it kind of goes through different phases during the day, big drum conference, and then the evening is usually kind of the fusion and big jam session, and international artists appear. But
Yeah.
this particular year, Zakir wanted to start with a kind of a jazz or fusion type presentation, which I think he was a little concerned about. But John had written a very beautiful piece of music called Abaji in tribute to Alarak Khan Sahib. So
Mm,
Zakir invited myself and John and Louis Banks, who is the kind of the father of jazz in
sure.
India right now, a wonderful pianist. He invited us to perform, so we were able to have rehearsals at Luigi's house,
Mm,
and then at 5 in the morning, show up and play this very beautiful composition. John then put that on his album Floating Point and invited
right.
me to participate. Most of that album was recorded actually in India, but
Uh-huh.
I did my parts remotely here in the US, and that album went on to be nominated for Grammys. So very nice to be part of it. And many of my friends are featured on it. Niladri Kumar, Shashank Shivamani is on there, Ranjit Barot. So
Okay.
yeah, that was a very special event in my
I'm
life.
sure it must have been quite memorable as well.
Oh yes, it was very, the concert takes place at the Shanmukananda Hall, which is,
In
I don't know,
Mumbai.
about 2 or 3 thousand people.
Mm,
And in 5 in the morning or 6 in the morning, when it's an extremely reverential audience, very serious listeners, many, many musicians. I made the mistake
mm,
that morning of showing up in my brand new, beautiful black kurta with gold stripes on it,
yeah.
very excited, but then saw that the other 2,000 people were all wearing white because that's the color. Oh my goodness. But luckily Zakir had happened to have an extra brand new kurta pajama,
Mm,
in
mm,
beautiful white
mm.
fabric that he gave me that morning.
Right.
So I wasn't embarrassed.
Absolutely. It's so very inspiring as an artist who's been trained in Western classical. What actually prompted you? Why did you feel attracted towards Indian classical music as such?
Well, I was exposed to it fairly young. I mean, as far as like my exposure to music at
Mm,
about 6 or 7, I was listening to the Beatles. You know, I
mm.
was born in 1956. So at that young age, the Beatles, Peter, Paul, and Mary, probably some Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
So kind of rock music, pop music. I started playing the saxophone around age 10 in a school band, just learning to read music, just learning to play. I was drawn to it. I probably got fairly good fairly quickly. I wasn't any kind of prodigy, and I didn't come up in a musical family, so it wasn't like I had particular exposure. At about 14, I was introduced to jazz. So I was introduced to the music of John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk, the great African American creators, innovators of this tradition.
Mm,
So I started kind of dabbling in that in sort of a self-taught way. I grew up outside of New York City, and I was able, the drinking age was very low. It was 18 at that time. So
mm,
14 or 15 years old, they weren't very strict. They would let me into a jazz club. So I would go to particularly a club called the Village Vanguard, a very famous jazz club in New York City, and get to hear people like Sonny Rollins and Betty Carter and McCoy Tyner, these real master musicians. And it was a small club, so I'd be sitting very close. So I was very inspired by jazz, although I thought my professional career was going to lead me into medicine. And I went off to college to be a pre-med student. While I was there, I got more involved in music. I started performing a little bit, was continuing my studies of jazz. I decided to leave that track. I came back to my parents' home on Long Island and started
mm,
studying with Frank Foster, who was the arranger and tenor player in the Count Basie Orchestra, and then at that time in the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Orchestra. So I
mm.
got deeper into jazz. I applied to the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston. I was accepted there, even though I would say, I was maybe behind many of the other students who had a maybe more rigorous musical upbringing. And
Mm.
while I was there, I just on a whim took a course called the Survey of Indian Classical Music.
Uh-huh.
And when I heard that, it was just bam. I just it just touched me here, it touched me here. And I think there was kind of at the time I was really into John Coltrane, who was kind of expressed a great deal of spirituality as
Mm,
well as intellectual depth and rigor in his music.
mm.
And I started listening to Ali Akbar Khan and the Dagger brothers and VG Jog and Ram Narayan, the kind of old real ustads and pundits who, I don't know, there's just something that just said, wow, I got to figure out what this is, and is there a way for me to approach this on my instrument? It didn't particularly excite the teachers who wanted to teach me jazz, but
Mm, mm,
because
mm.
it was very, it was very tangential. It was very much an offshoot. They had a more limited vision of what a jazz artist was. I continued to pursue it on my own. I graduated from the conservatory,
Mm.
and while I was in Boston, I met a young woman who's now my wife of 40 years. And
Oh,
she's an American woman, but she had gotten to know about the Sufi tradition as it came through Hazrat Inayat Khan and Pir Vilayat Khan.
mm,
And so she was involved with kind of the spiritual understanding that came from India.
mm,
We had a brief encounter in Boston. She moved to California, and
mm.
Northern California is kind of a center of Indian classical music, as maybe you know. Ali Akbar Khan has his
Yeah.
college here. Zakir Hussain lives here. G.S. Sachdev, the flute player, was living here. Krishna Bhatt, the sitarist,
Mm.
and Pandit Pranath, who you see in the picture behind me,
Oh, yeah.
who was teaching at Mills College where my wife was attending. Actually, when I arrived, some of the first gigs I got were actually playing in an Indian restaurant with some of Ali Akbar Khan's students. So
Wow.
I was, trying to figure things out about raga. I really appreciated the way one studies notes and expresses emotion and different things through the raga system. So Emily, my wife, was at Mills College where Pandit Pranath was teaching, as was this great American composer pianist Terry Riley, who was one of the
Correct.
important students of Pandit Pranath. With my good fortune, Emily got a fellowship to study in India when she graduated from Mills College. She was invited to study with Sri Karunamai, who was a student of Pandit Pranath. So we went in 1980 to India, and many adventures and mind-blowing experiences
Wow.
occurred in 1980s India, where there were virtually no telephones and certainly no computers. And
Yeah. Mm.
no internet. Before we left, we studied Hindi for about 6 months at UC Berkeley, as well as with a private tutor. So, and while we were in India, Pandit Pranath was there, and
Mm.
he and I just kind of hit it off very well. He liked the fact that I had a little bit of pre-medical training, and he had had a heart attack a couple of years before. I also
Oh.
know how to cook well, and I would cook for him without salt, which apparently nobody else in India would do at the time because it was
Good.
important for his heart. And I could massage him the way he liked. He started teaching me. I think he told me right away that I was more likely to continue being a saxophone player than a singer. But
Wow.
our relationship became very close, and it gave me an understanding of raga. We
Mm.
got tamboras, we sang daily, and it gave me an understanding of the culture. I think I really got to feel living there for 10 months at that time.
Mm.
You know,
Absolutely. I mean,
I think I just had a perspective that was maybe different than if I had stayed in the US to study Indian music.
I'm sure such cross-cultural collaborations will only enhance our knowledge, right? I mean, our learning. It's a different kind of experience altogether.
At this point I don't speak Hindi that well, but I understand a lot of it. All the foods I want to eat, I can say
Oh,
all,
yeah.
and most of the musical terms I can
Mm.
express.
Mm.
I can get angry at a
Fantastic.
taxi driver if I need to. When you speak a little bit in a language that isn't your own, it actually, I think you think a little bit differently as
Yes.
well. And so when you speak in a musical language and you spend time, as I've been very blessed to do, with masters of this music,
Mm.
then you start, you know, if I'm sitting on stage or in rehearsal with somebody like Pandit Hari Prasad Chaurasia,
Mm.
you know, his mind is so big and his understanding is so strong that it kind of floats into my head, and in some ways his thoughts kind of lift mine, his understanding lifts mine. So if I'm sitting with my Guruji and looking into his face as he's like placing his understanding into my head. So sitting with these masters is just the greatest education, and some of them are my peers, like Krishna Bhatt, a wonderful sitar player,
Mm.
originally from Jaipur, who lived a block away from me here in Berkeley for many years, and so
Oh.
was my collaborator on my first album.
Mm.
And a big teacher. And Krishna, and myself and Terry Riley used to tour together. There's so much growth and so much learning. The relationships I have with these peer musicians, as well as with these ustads who have
Mm.
shared their knowledge with me. I mean, that's really the greatest musical blessing in my
I'm
life.
sure. Such beautiful experiences. You said it rightly. The more we learn about a different culture, especially their music, their language, the more closer we are able to relate to them, learn about that place, the origin of how the music actually came from, and all those really enhances our learning process. At the end of the day, yes, feeling accomplished is what I would say.
Yeah, it also inspires me to go deeper into my tradition, because if I'm sitting with somebody who's so immersed in their tradition, I
Mhm.
want to be able to offer as much as I can from my tradition. And when I say my tradition, I like to think of myself as a saxophonist,
Yeah,
following the lineage of the great, mainly African American saxophonists
yeah.
who
Mm.
who started this, as well as pianists and guitarists. But I studied the jazz canon, shall we call it, the jazz history, the jazz legacy, the
Okay.
music of Thelonious Monk, the music of Duke Ellington,
Mm.
John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins. So, and I'm constantly going back to drink from that well, the well of the American jazz tradition, the well of the Indian classical tradition. And, I keep drinking as much as I can, and then hope that that gives me the opportunity to create something that's unique to me, that expresses some kind of truth about what I've learned about being on planet Earth at this time.
Absolutely, that's so beautiful. Do you perform differently when there isn't an audience in front of you? How is it like?
Yes, yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't try to perform differently,
Mm.
but there is some kind of exchange of the energy that happens when you're with an audience. And so, you try to keep your mind clear when you're performing, and the mind is clear at the best times, and you're communicating with the musicians around you and just kind of feeling this energy coming from above and from around. But when you're with an audience, you are giving and they are giving back. So, they feed that energy. And for me, it gives me a sense of purpose. Why would I be performing if
Mm,
I'm not offering something to someone? So, I think of my performing as an offering. And if somebody's there to receive it, it makes more sense.
fantastic. Yeah, I can't agree more with you. What are your favorite memories of working with Ustad Zakir Hussain?
Oh, there are many.
If you could cite a couple of them.
Well, I think probably recording the first album was a big deal. I'd been working on a bunch of the compositions with Krishna Bhatt, as I mentioned, and he lived, as I said, just a block away. And Zakir Bhai came by the house, I don't know, for a cup of chai or coffee. And we talked about the fact that we were working on this album. And he said, "Oh, well, if you need a tabla player, what about me?" And I was like,
Oh,
so the next day I called him and I said, "Did you mean that? And can I afford you?"
mm,
And he said, let's not talk about money. Let's listen to the music first and see what happens. He listened to the music. He liked it. We set up a recording session. I think he like flew in from somewhere, went to
mm.
his house, changed his clothes, and was on his way back to the airport. Stopped at the recording studio. First time hearing the music, and the music was a little complicated. It didn't stay in one rhythmic cycle. It would be like I'd be sitting in front of him going 7, and now 11, and now it's 8. First take, played beautifully, and then he left for the airport. Well, that was amazing. And then they offered to release the album on their record label, which was great. So that was you know a great moment, an
Mm, mm.
awakening.
I'm
The
sure.
morning with John McLaughlin was very special. Then later I formed a band called Summit with Zakir and great drummer Steve Smith, Fareed Haq on guitar, Kai Eckhart on bass. We had some performances that just really felt, where everything was perfectly aligned. There was one in Hong Kong that was, I just felt where I could let everything go, and just the energy of the music was just lifting us along.
Fantastic. What and where are you most looking forward to playing during the lockdown?
Actually, my first live performance is happening next month.
Fantastic.
I'm really excited about it. Just before the lockdown in February of 2020, actually.
Mm,
One of the very last performances. I've done performances over the years for the people who run the Jaipur Literature Festival,
yeah. Mhm.
and they had introduced me to a very young pianist named Utsav Lal. He's a student of Wasifuddin Dagar, so he's got this very deep classical training, as well as Sharat Shrivastava, who's a
Yeah.
violinist from Delhi. And from Delhi, I'm not quite sure how, but he got to the Royal Conservatory of Scotland, where he
Okay.
was studying Western classical and jazz. And then actually to the school that I went to, he got his master's at New England Conservatory in
Oh.
Boston. And he's a serious fan of Terry Riley, who's been a very important influence and collaborator in my life. So I
Mm.
invited him out for a concert that we did with Selva Ganesh Ram.
All
And
right.
that was February 27th of 2020, as
Right.
we all know.
Yeah.
Everything shut down, but I continued to develop our relationship virtually, and we made 2 recordings that are up on YouTube.
Mhm.
We made them remotely. He in Brooklyn, New York, me
Mm.
in California, and now, as I said, as things are just starting to open up here in California, I mean in the United States,
Mm.
we're doing a concert on July 11th at a place called The Mount. It's the home of the writer Edith Wharton, the former home, and it's in Lenox, Massachusetts. So I'm flying to New York on the 7th. We'll rehearse and then go up there to perform. So
Looking forward
you
to
know,
that, I'm sure.
very looking forward to it. And then I have a performance when I come back with Kala Ramnath. And she's been an important collaborator and another teacher to me. One of these, as I said, peer teachers who are my peers as well. And, got such deep knowledge and amazing
Amazing
uh,
musician. Yeah.
technical ability and huge heart.
Fantastic. What has been the dominant paradigm for jazz music improvisation?
It's kind of impossible for me to answer.
Right.
Dominant paradigm. I think there's so many things that come together, and I think they come together in different ways for different musicians. You have to study the sort of language, the vocabulary of the masters who came before,
Mm.
who developed the language of the music.
Mm.
then for me, there's like individual study, and some of it comes through the teaching I do. But I've been looking at the composition of Wayne Shorter called "Infant Eyes," and just tune I've looked at for many years, but thinking more about, how did he construct this piece, and
Mm.
every day you can look at, I don't know, it feels to me you can look at a major scale, which maybe is the first thing you learned, and have different thoughts about it, and deeper understanding and different perspectives. So for me, there's study of the masters in the jazz tradition, because you asked about jazz improvisation.
Yeah.
There's study of theory. At this point, I've written a lot of music, so often there's the study of my own music to get a better understanding of things that maybe I did intuitively, and then trying to understand maybe structurally what was I intuitively understanding that now I want to understand more deeply. There's
Sure.
the technical proficiency of the instrument that I have to constantly work on, because you want to be able to have an idea
Mm.
that immediately comes into your head and is immediately available through your technique.
Mm.
For me, there's also the study of Indian classical music that I keep going back to, because I think it brings a certain flavor or perspective to my jazz improvisation. And jazz is a word that I'm, kind of wary of as it relates to my self. I don't know that I consider myself a jazz musician, but I'm somebody who has studied jazz and knows a lot about jazz, and I play an instrument that's mostly associated with jazz.
That's good.
There are others who are actually masters in that tradition, and the word is, one that's kind of constantly redefined. And some people who the outside world looks at as jazz musicians prefer not to use it. So,
Yeah.
but
Mm.
improvisation, I think, requires study, it requires practice, it requires inspiration.
I'm sure these information would be very valuable. A person pursuing saxophone or any form of instrument would really benefit a lot from your advice, George.
Okay, good.
See, it's important for us to keep up with the camaraderie of our fellow musicians. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, for me, it's all been about relationships. It's important for me to have relationships with the artists that I work with. It's just been essential, and my associations tend to have been long ones, with Krishna Bhatt, with Zakir Hussain, with
Mhm.
Terry Riley. People who are mentors and friends, and especially since I walk a path that takes me to a culture that I wasn't born into.
Yeah.
So I think the relationships with the artists helps me find my place there.
Sure. If I understand correctly, I read somewhere you worked with a few of your albums, especially with, as a soloist with John McLaughlin's Floating Point
Mhm.
album has received or it was nominated for a Grammy Award. So,
Mhm.
what do these nominations really mean to you? And why do you think, as a musician, such accolades are also important?
I don't think they're that important. I think it's something that everybody appreciates when they get nominated, or they win. It brings them a certain element of recognition. But I think ultimately, if you feel good about the work you've done,
Yeah,
that's much more. Or artists that you appreciate the work you've done. That's more of an accolade. I know people, awards are things that people can grab onto kind of easily,
sure,
but
sure. Yeah.
and it can make a difference in some people's careers. But
Mm, I completely agree with you. What's your primary role as an educator?
one of the things that I'd say my educating has evolved into is actually teaching about Western music to Indian artists. At this point, there are many
Mm,
great Indian musicians
mm,
who are interested in understanding more, Indian classical musicians, I should say, in particular, who are
mm,
interested in understanding more about how Western musicians think about music. And
mm.
I think because I've spent so much time with Indian classical music, I think I have a way of communicating some of those thoughts and relating them to raga. Although, the worlds are pretty different for many people.
Yeah,
That's one of the things that I hope to give back to these Indian classical artists who've been so generous to me with their music. If I can offer some insight into how we think about music from a harmonic perspective, and what the Western thought process
yeah,
might be in music. That's kind of where I'd say my better teaching is done. If I can offer kind of a window into Western thought, musical thought to some of these great artists who've given me so much. That's where I hope my teaching will go.
Fantastic. That's very inspiring. And what would be your advice to the young aspiring musicians who would like to pursue music as a full-time career?
Well, depending on where they are in their development,
Mhm.
practice rigorously, find great teachers where you can, listen to as much music as possible, but do try to stay focused in a certain realm. Don't expect fame and riches.
Very
You know,
important, isn't it?
speak through your music as honestly as possible about who
Mm.
you are and what you hope for the world. Be on time. Don't be egoful. Listen and respect your elders. Practice and then practice some more and practice some more.
Excellent.
And establish relationships with
Yeah.
your peers. Try to make music with people. I think in the internet age, you can sit at home and make music by yourself and maybe it'll be great. I think there's greater value in connecting with people. Be part of your community, be part of your musical community and your greater community. Imagine that you're offering a gift to the world and make it special.
Beautiful. We now move on to the second segment of the chat, which is called the lighter side of you. How would you describe yourself in 3 words, George?
Compassionate, introspective, and friendly.
What was the last song you downloaded?
Was actually Vikuji, Viku Vinayak Ram,
Yeah. Mm.
and Swaminathan Selva-Ganesh, who's his grandson,
Mm.
at a live concert at the Afghan church in Mumbai. But Vikuji was playing with the other percussionists, and Swaminathan was reciting these shlokas in rhythmic fashion. And I
Right.
downloaded that to share with some young artists, American artists
Right.
who rap. They're part of a group actually called Alphabet Rockers who won a Grammy. But I
Oh,
wanted to show them about this Indian style of recitation that maybe has some parallels to rap music.
that's interesting. Yeah.
That's the last thing I downloaded.
The place you would most want to travel?
At this point, anywhere. No, I love going back to India. I think because my wife wants to go there, I think Greece is next.
That's a lovely place.
But one area that I have not really traveled is South America. I'm eager to go there. I speak Spanish quite well.
If you could get yourself anything, what would that be? What would you want?
Contentment.
What's been your lifelong dream?
Maybe to be a good enough musician to satisfy myself.
What advice did you get that was most rewarding so far?
In spontaneity, it made me think of something that Zakir said, maybe when we were looking at recording. I think I asked if I should try to target types of music that were selling well at the time. And he said, why would you do that? If you do that and it fails, then you've got nothing. If you make the album that satisfies you as an artist, it may or may not sell, but at least you will feel that you're satisfied with the art that you've created.
What's the first concert that you attended, even as a child?
Well, as a child, I think my grandmother would take me to see these Gilbert and Sullivan musicals, if you know.
Right.
Gilbert and Sullivan, the composers, things like, was it the HMS Pinafore, the Mikado? I think that's the first music I ever heard as a little kid.
Right.
Then I probably went to a rock concert, maybe Jethro Tull. But then pretty young, like I said, the Village Vanguard, like as a maybe 14, 15 years old, hearing, and I don't remember if the first one was Bill Evans or Betty Carter, but fantastic, real giants of the jazz tradition.
Amazing. What's your favorite food?
Food. I really like food. I love to cook. I have a big garden full of vegetables.
Any particular favorite?
My tastes are vast.
Oh, right. Who or what was your biggest teacher in your life?
My Guruji Pandit Pranath, Terry Riley, Krishna Bhatt, so many of the musicians, people I've never met, John Coltrane, music that I've listened to, but really there was a saxophone teacher named Joe Allard, who was an older man when I studied with him at the conservatory, taught me a lot about saxophone sound. But my Guruji, Pandit Pranath, incredible teacher. But I try to learn from everyone. I really do. I think there's a lot to learn.
It's been a very inspiring and lively chat for me today, George, and I hope you enjoyed the questions as much as I did.
Thank you.
And so we come to the end of this chat, and I want to thank you for your valuable time.
You're quite welcome. It's been very enjoyable.
Namaste.
Namaste. We'll talk soon.